Okay, well, I finally decided to get up off my arse and start making some YouTube videos on sort of political, philosophical sort of issues. The main catalyst for me doing it now is a series of comment wars that I've had with YouTube user, and I'm going to say the name wrong. It's written as if it was Lengthyounarther, but I'm almost sure that's not how you pronounce it, so forgive me. I'll call him Length for the purposes of this video. A series of comment wars that we've had on the issue of the Labour theory of value and Marxism in general. I consider myself a Marxist and a socialist. Length is obviously very much neither of these things. So this is just going to be really a defence of the Labour theory of value, and in the main a response to a video of Length's recently about the Labour theory of value and the minimum wage, in which he responded really quite directly to the comment wars that he and I had. Excuse me. This particular video will be mainly about the Labour theory of value, and then hopefully I'll talk about the minimum wage in another one. So, as a little sort of prelude, Marxist theory can be divided into two broad sectors, really: the political and the economic. And they are quite different. Almost all of Marx's work, the vast majority of it, is economic in texture. Obviously there's a good amount of political stuff there, but in the main Marx was an economic writer, and he wrote about capitalism and capitalists. He was a theorist of capitalism, not really a theorist of socialism. And it was down to subsequent writers to become theorists of socialism and to take what Marx had said about economics and mould it into a sort of a justification or a foundation for a certain political doctrine. But Marx mainly wrote about capitalism, and the Labour theory of value is a theory of capitalism, not of socialism. And I'm saying this because quite a lot of what Length was going on about was to do with kind of a perceived inconsistency in the Labour theory of value when applied to socialism. And that really doesn't have much to do with what Marx was writing about, and I'll explain why later on. So, as I say, Length was responding to comment wars that we had had. One of the things that he said was that I had said, arguing from a Marxist position, and Length does sort of take my position to be the general Marxist view, that labour is the irreducible quality in all commodities, and that this is why labour is the source of value, hence the Labour theory of value. Now, if I ever did say that labour was the irreducible quality in all commodities, I shouldn't have. I suspect what I did say was that it was something common to all commodities. And Length quite correctly points out that even if that is true, even if we can say that is true, that labour is something common to all commodities, there are many other qualities that are common to all commodities. And Length mentions, for instance, human attention, energy, mass, matter, ingenuity, volition, comprehension. Those are all equally common to all commodities. Some of those words are a bit iffy, but certainly mass and energy, velocity, volume, you could say, are all common to all commodities. And so why privilege labour as the thing which produces value? The Marxian answer to that is that all of those other qualities, physical, geometric, chemical, and so on qualities, change the use values of the commodity. That is, an alteration in the mass or the energy or anything else of the commodity changes its use value. Now, use value is a concept in Marx which is separate from just value. Use value means essentially the utility gleaned from the concrete qualities possessed by commodities. So use values are, in a certain sense, utilities. Perhaps it's not safe to say that that's exactly what use values are, but it's a Marxian way of saying utility, really. what Marx is trying to do with the labour theory of value is to ascertain how the world of commodities, which is such a multifarious world of different things, qualitatively different things, how, when they're all brought to market, do they become commensurable? Do they become comparable in different magnitudes? Because ultimately that's what prices are. They are a number that expresses a magnitude which is different between commodities, and all commodities are different. And Marx wants to find out how can we possibly find a quantitative measure of all of these different commodities when they're all so different. So you can imagine, if you imagine you have two piles of apples of different sizes, they can be very directly compared in terms of their magnitudes, because their magnitudes can be measured in terms of what they are themselves. So the larger pile of apples will contain more apples. You can measure the magnitude of the two piles of apples in themselves, in apples, and because they're qualitatively the same, you get an accurate reading of a quantitative difference between them. If, on the other hand, you wanted to compare a pile of apples and a tree, this would be rather more difficult. You can't compare it in apples, you can't compare it in trees. So there isn't a very direct way. The only way that you could do it would be to find out, you'd have to find a third thing which can kind of arbitrate between them, which can make them quantitatively comparable. What Marx holds is that the only way to make something quantitatively comparable is to make it qualitatively the same. So in the instance of apples and trees, for instance, you could say that that third thing was mass, one of the things on Length's list. Mass is neither apples nor trees. It's common to both apples and trees, and by measuring the mass, we're able to make quantitatively commensurable something which wasn't previously. But the problem with measuring something in mass is that differences in mass are also differences in use values. Differences in energy are differences in use values. You cannot have two things with different masses that are the same thing. Labour is an example of something which is common to all commodities, but wherein differences between the labour input of a commodity do not necessarily change the use values of the commodity. Two of the same commodity can have different labour inputs. So if I make a chair in 1 hour and you make a chair in 2 hours, but it's the same chair, I'm just slower than you, nothing has changed in terms of the chairs. They're both qualitatively the same. They can still be measured in terms of chairs. So per hour I produce 1 chair, you produce 2 chairs. Qualitatively they're the same, but they can be measured now quantitatively. So essentially there's 3 characteristics which, according to Marx, something must fulfill in order to be the measure of value. It must be in itself measurable. It must have a unit in which it can be measured. Labour, of course, can be measured in time. There are other things which can be which have units of measurement, such as mass, but mass doesn't fulfill the other 2 characteristics, as you'll see now. But also this first criteria, that it be measurable in itself, that it have a unit, discounts use value as the measure of value, because use values, being qualitatively completely different, being qualitatively dissimilar, cannot be directly measured. You can't measure the use value of a chair, its sitability, with the use value of a bed, the fact that it's comfortable, you can sleep in it. Because they're 2 totally different things, They don't have a unit of measurement. The second criteria is that it be common to all commodities. Obviously labour fulfills that as well. And it must also make all commodities qualitatively the same. That is, it must, the abstraction where we conceive of things in terms of the labour that's gone into them, doesn't alter the use values of those things. Whereas mass, energy, volume and so on literally changes the physical form of the commodity. It changes it qualitatively, and if you change something qualitatively, you render it quantitatively incommensurable with other objects. Okay, we'll move on to the next thing now. So length states that there are many things which require very little labour and which fetch high prices. Now, I'm struggling to think of an example of something which takes a very small amount of labour to produce, and yet which fetches a much higher price than something which would take, on average, much less labour to produce. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Cars take a lot of labour to produce, and they cost quite a lot of money. A pint of beer takes very little labour to produce per pint of beer, and it's quite cheap in comparison to a car. A house takes more labour generally than a car, and it's much more expensive. Things like diamonds take an enormous amount of labour per chunk of diamond, and so a very small amount of diamond is worth a lot of money. Things which take no labour at all to produce, like air, are valueless. They're free. You know, in order for something to be a commodity, it really has to satisfy two conditions. It has to have utility, it has to be useful to human beings, and it has to contain human labour. It must take human labour to produce it. Air, gravity, have no labour in them, and thus they're absolutely worthless. So I really can't think of something which defies that pattern of high labour inputs and high prices, and low labour inputs and low prices. There are some things, for instance, like great works of art, which can be priced at millions of pounds. But that's just the other end of the spectrum from air and gravity. That's something which, contrary to air and gravity, which take no labour to produce, they're completely abundant. A great masterpiece of art is something which would take an almost infinite amount of labour. It's actually not reproducible. It would take an infinite amount of labour to produce, and thus it can be priced at almost anything. So again, I can't really think of anything that defies that basic trend. Length states that I have said that values and prices are different. They are different. Prices and values are not the same. They're not words that describe the same things. Prices are what you see on a price tag, and values are an underlying labour value. But Marx's point is that, and really the point of the labour theory of value, is that prices orbit quite closely values. They might go above and below it due to fluctuations in supply and demand, but there's a kind of a baseline price which represents labour values, abstract labour values, socially necessary abstract labour times, in fact, or SNALT, which I'll go into in a bit. But for the purposes of basic discussion, values and prices are the same. All the way through Capital Volume 1, Marx talks as though values and prices are the same. So it is what Marx calls values, labour time values, that produce prices. Now, Length has said in his video that I've said that use values produce prices. I'm almost certain I haven't said that. Use values, according to Marx, definitely don't produce prices. That's more of a marginalist view, that it's the utility value that produces the price. From the Marxian perspective, use values are just a precondition of something entering into the sphere of being a commodity, of being saleable. Something must have a utility to be saleable, and thus to be a commodity. If it doesn't have any utility, it's not saleable. But the magnitude of utility is not what conditions prices. Because, as I've said before, the magnitude of utility can't be compared across commodities, because they're too different. Use values, the properties of commodities are too different. So it's labour which accounts for differences in prices across commodities, but utility is absolutely necessary. You can't have something which is a commodity that has no utility. There's this old critique of Marx of the mud pie argument where, if somebody makes a mud pie and it takes them 100 hours, is that worth loads because, it takes loads of labour? Well, no, because it has no utility. And Marx is very clear about the fact that something must have utility in order to be a commodity. There's no point talking about value, the value of objects which are not commodities, because values are something to do with markets and economics and buying and selling. Air has an enormous amount of utility and clearly no value. So something must be the product of human labour, and it must have utility to be a commodity in the first place. But then the determinant of price is labour and not use values. Okay, so Length goes on to discuss the nature of labour. He's concerned that Marxists have a very sort of amorphous definition of labour. They don't explain what it is, and so if you don't have a good handle on what labour is, how can you say that it's the measure of value? Fair point. So Length asks, is it labour in terms of the force of the labourer, the force imparted to objects, the energy that undergoes transition? Would you measure it in joules or whatever? Is labour which applies more force more labour than labour which is intellectual and which is based upon skill and a soft touch, for instance? Now, it's true that Marx holds that the more labour there is taken to produce commodities, the more the value of the commodity is. But we have to be clear about what Marx means by labour. There are two kinds of labour in Marx. There's concrete labour, which is really the sort of labour that Length is describing. Labour in all of its material specificity. Is it technical labour? Is it labour which requires lots of strength? Is it intellectual labour? And then there's abstract labour, which essentially means average labour. Labour shorn of its individual characteristics and made into a metric of the production of commodities. All averages are abstract. When we measure, what's the average wealth in a country, we ignore the low end, we ignore the high end, we even ignore the high and low ends of the middle, and we make it into an average. Nevertheless, we still arrive at a true statement. The average wealth in Britain is £15,000 or whatever, average income. It's true, it's a true statement, but it's abstracted away from all particulars. And this is what abstract labour is in Marx. The crucial question to ask is, the manner in which we measure labour is in the productiveness of commodities. So, let's imagine a situation where there's two people in a factory making chairs, making the same chairs. I make 1 chair per hour, and you make 2 chairs per hour. That is a comparison of our concrete labour. You make twice as many chairs as I do. You probably work twice as fast. So the speed of your labour, that's a particular characteristic, is more than mine. But in Marxian theory, both chairs contain the same amount of abstract labour. and that's the average. So both chairs, even though they took individually two different amounts of concrete labour, with all of the material specificities of those labour powers, different concentration, different amounts of enjoyment by the labourer, different speed, different transference of energy, and so on, the abstract labour involved in both of them is the same. It's the average labour. So it's 1.5 hours. So the concrete labour in chair 1 is 1 hour. The concrete labour in each of the two chairs that the faster worker produced is half an hour. He only took half an hour per chair. But the abstract labour in both is 1.5 hours. And that's the labour that Marx is talking about when he talks about labour value. Average labour times. And you can extrapolate this out to a situation in which factories are competing with one another. So if we've got two factories, so let's say we've got the factory we started with our two workers. Okay, it's unrealistic, but that could easily be expanded out. Which has each chair represents 1.5 hours of abstract labour time. And you've got a second factory wherein they also average 1.5 hours of abstract labour time. Because all of those chairs are being compared on the market, remember that it's market competition itself. It's the fact that they are commodities, that they are being exchanged, that they are being compared in a market, that brings out the efficacy of labour times as the measure of value. The abstract labour time, represented by each one of the chairs that both factories have produced, is 1.5 hours. But let's say you had two factories, and one of them produced chairs with an average labour time of 2 hours, and one produced chairs with an average labour time of 4 hours. Still, when they go to market, all of those chairs will behave in the market as though they had a labour time of 3 hours. The socially necessary abstract labour time of all the chairs produced by all the factories that produce that chair is the same, and it's the average labour time taken throughout all of those factories. So a central idea here is that it doesn't matter how forceful, fast, skilled the labour of one particular worker is on one particular commodity, because all of that's going to be abstracted away in the market calculation of abstract labour times. If you have a factory where you've got one worker who produces so quickly that he produces 100 chairs an hour, and you've got 99 other workers who only produce 1 chair an hour, the value of the chairs that the very fast worker produced is going to be fed into by the much slower production times of all of the other slower workers. The market will always abstract away from all of these particulars, and it will just ask the question, how many chairs got produced in how long? And that's all it's going to care about. Now, Length seems to be making the point that the labour theory of value is kind of a prescription, kind of an idea where you say, well, here's how much labour value was produced by this and that worker, and so here's what they ought to be paid. There's nothing like that in Marx. That is, an unknowing, I'm sure, straw man. Under capitalism, workers are paid on the basis of the value of their labour power. Labour power is a commodity like anything else. Labour power is not measured in terms of the value of the things that labour power produces. And in fact, the difference between the value of labour power and the value of what it produces is the whole basis of Marx's theory of exploitation. which I won't go into here, but in a future video. The value of labour power, like every other commodity, is determined by the average amount of labour taken to produce that commodity, the commodity labour power. Well, what produces labour power? Well, it's all of the commodities which the labourer must consume in order to live and be reproduced in a fit state for work. So the value of labour power is the value of the groceries, the house, the car, the bills, and so on, of the worker, in small increments, obviously, weekly, monthly, yearly, and so on. So in terms of the value of the things that he's producing, which, remember, isn't based upon his own concrete labour. His own concrete labour feeds into the values of what he produces, but ultimately the values of what he produces is just as much based upon how long it took everybody else making that commodity to make their commodities. So that when all the commodities meet each other in the marketplace, the significance of the abstract or average labour time is brought out. Now, in terms of the remuneration of the worker, I mean, I'll talk more about this hopefully in the video on the minimum wage, but it certainly wouldn't be based on the value that the individual worker produced, because as Length rightly states, that wouldn't be very egalitarian or socialistic, because it would mean that workers who produce lots of value get lots, and workers who aren't very productive don't get a lot. Now, actually, if you were going to remunerate workers based strictly on the law of value, workers would be paid in quite an egalitarian fashion, because they would all be paid a proportion of this average value. There would be an abstraction away from all the individual levels of productivity, just as there is in the marketplace. Ultimately, though, socialism does not need to obey the law of value in the same way that capitalism does, because it's really the market. And I think I'll have to explain this in more detail in another video, but it's the market that brings out the significance of the law of value. Under socialism, the remuneration of workers can be according to any other principle, really. It could just be based on conscious decision making. Generally, most socialists, communists, Marxists hold to the idea that things be done on the basis of from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So this need have nothing to do with the law of value in terms of, what's the specific value of labour, what's the value of the bundle of commodities that the labourer consumes to reproduce himself, or what's the value of what he produces. It can be done in a totally different way. It's only under capitalism that workers are remunerated on the basis of the law of value, and then it's not the value of what they produce, but the value of their own commodity labour power. So, the last thing I'll talk about here, Length talks about, even if he were to grant that there was something like Marxian labour value at work, or Marxian labour even, because he's not convinced there's even such a thing as labour in the Marxian sense. I hope I've clarified a bit that it's the average amount of commodities that's produced within an entire market, not anything to do with the concrete attributes of labour. But even if there is such a thing as Marxian labour, says Length, it's an equivocation to then say that labour equals value. And he says, you can't measure things by completely different things. You can't measure right and wrong by energy, for instance. Okay, so there's a real issue, I think, when there's discussions between Marxists and people who follow vaguely marginalist views of economics, subjective theories of value. There's a real issue around the definition of value. I think both sides have a habit of thinking that they are both describing the same phenomenon and disagreeing about the origin of that phenomenon. And it's because we both use the word value. We're both seeking to explain what value is. Oh, I've got an objective theory of value, you've got a subjective theory of value, who's right? In reality, objective theories of value like Marx's and subjective theories of value like that of the marginalists are describing two different things. Subjective, from the Marxian perspective, subjective values and objective values both exist, and they're two distinct things. Subjective values are people's individual valuations of the utility of things. That clearly occurs, that's a real phenomenon. And objective values are the market regulation of prices, ultimately, on the basis of average labour times. And from the Marxian perspective, that's a real phenomenon, and they exist side by side. I think Length thinks that I'm trying to explain subjective value either away, either just to get rid of it, or on the basis of Marxian value. And that's just not the case. I think the main difference is that Marxists think that it's the objective dimension of value, the material basis of value in labour, that conditions general trends in prices and the differences between prices between commodities. Whereas marginalists think that it's subjective value, subjective evaluations of utility, that create prices. That's the difference. I don't think the difference is that we both have two different ways of explaining the same thing, value. I think we really are using the word value in a completely different way. I think I'll probably leave it there, and I think that's a good place to leave it, because I think that can be built upon. The idea of distinguishing between two different, not just definitions of value, but two different forms of value is a useful one, and maybe that can help us in future discussions. And I'd be glad to have further discussions with Length or anybody else. So next time I'll probably respond a bit more to that video of Length's, but more to the stuff on the minimum wage. So there we go. Thanks.